Hello, my name is Joanna Lemley. I'm a wetland ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program at Colorado State University. The following presentation will define the target population used by the Field Protocol for Lentic, Riparian, and Wetland Systems and the Riparian and Wetland Aim Program. This video presentation covers information provided in Section 1.2 of the draft protocol. The Field Protocol for Lentic, Riparian, and Wetland Systems is intended for vegetated riparian and wetland areas, which are sometimes referred to as lentic areas. These include wet and mesic meadows, marshes, seeps and springs, peatlands, including fens, bogs, and muskegs, vegetated playas, vernal pools, prairie potholes, kettle ponds, vegetated drainageways, swales, riparian shrublands and forests, oxbows, beaver complexes, floodplains, and the margins of ponds, lakes, and reservoirs. For consistent application in the field, the protocol contains a set of 6 field criteria to determine if a site meets the applicable ecosystems. The criteria are related to vegetation, hydrology, and size. We will go over them in more detail in just a few moments. For each riparian and wetland aim monitoring project, a target population must be defined. In general, the target population for most projects is the same as the applicable ecosystems outlined in the protocol. However, management questions may further refine the target population for a specific project by other attributes, like the administrative unit, wetland type, management priority, such as sage-grouse habitat, or even a specific zone of interest within a wetland. Keep in mind that a given project may have a more specific target population, but in general, the target population is the same as the applicable ecosystems. There are 3 key words or phrases in the applicable ecosystems that warrant additional explanation. Those are riparian areas, wetlands, and lentic areas. We will spend a little time discussing those terms before returning to the 6 field criteria. Aquatic resources are highly varied. The defining characteristic of aquatic resources is water in its many forms and pathways. Water enters a watershed as snow or rain and moves through the landscape either rapidly in stream channels or more slowly if infiltrated into the groundwater or pooled in ponds, lakes, and marshes. As water moves across, under, and through the landscape, it influences vegetation and creates a variety of habitats. As humans, it is our instinct to classify and categorize this diversity into manageable boxes. Classification bounds the range of variation and is useful for inventory and mapping, assessment, monitoring, and management. There are a variety of words used to describe and classify aquatic resources. A separate presentation will explore the major classification systems in more detail. In this presentation, I will focus on the broadest concepts that are used to define the riparian and wetland aim target population: riparian areas, wetlands, and lentic areas. I will start with riparian areas. There are several recognized definitions for riparian areas. Shown on this slide is the definition used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the purpose of mapping riparian areas from aerial photography. This definition states, riparian areas are plant communities contiguous to and affected by the surface and subsurface hydrology of rivers, streams, lakes, or drainageways. Riparian areas have one or both of the following characteristics: distinctively different vegetation than adjacent areas, or species similar to adjacent areas but exhibiting more rigorous or robust growth forms. Riparian areas can be transitional between wetland and upland. The characteristics of riparian areas then are water. Riparian areas are contiguous to water bodies, including rivers, streams, and lakes, and they are affected by their hydrology. Plants. Riparian areas are vegetation communities that differ from the surrounding uplands, either in species composition or more robust growth form. Soils. Riparian soils are influenced by the movement of water, but do not necessarily show the chemical and physical properties of hydric soils that are found in wetlands, which we'll describe next. I'd like to note that publications from other agencies use slightly different words to describe riparian areas. This slide contains 3 other definitions. The first states a riparian area is the transition between the aquatic area and the adjacent uplands. These areas exhibit vegetation or physical characteristics reflective of permanent surface or subsurface water influence. The second states a riparian area is an area of land directly influenced by permanent water. It has visible vegetation or physical characteristics reflective of permanent water influence. Lake shores and stream banks are typical riparian areas. And the third states a riparian ecosystem is a transition between the aquatic ecosystem and the adjacent terrestrial ecosystem, and is identified by soil characteristics and distinctive vegetation communities that require free and unbound water. Common elements in these definitions include a landscape position adjacent to and influenced by surface water bodies and the resulting vegetation community. However, most of these definitions are not accompanied by clear guidance on how to delineate riparian areas in the field. What is a wetland? There's greater precision and agreement around the definition of wetlands, largely because wetlands are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers and Environmental Protection Agency under the Federal Clean Water Act. It is imperative that people across the country share a common understanding of how to delineate wetland boundaries. This slide shows the definition of wetland used by the Army Corps of Engineers in their Wetland Delineation Manual. This definition states, wetlands are those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. The characteristics of wetlands are water. Wetlands are defined by the frequency and duration of inundation or saturation. This is called wetland hydrology and is generally a minimum of 15 consecutive days during the growing season, though it can be much longer. We will be discussing wetland hydrology in detail in another presentation. Plants. Wetlands are defined by hydrophytic or water-loving vegetation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Army Corps of Engineers have developed a national wetland plant list that includes a wetland indicator status rating for any plant that occurs in wetlands. Hydrophytic vegetation is specifically communities dominated by obligate, facultative wetland, and facultative plant species. Lastly, soils. Wetland soils are called hydric soils, and they have chemical and physical characteristics that reflect inundation or saturation. The Natural Resource Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture has developed a list of hydric soil indicators that can be observed in wetlands. Those include features like accumulated organic matter, reddish redoxomorphic concentrations, or pale gray glade soil. We will be discussing hydric soils in more detail in another presentation. It can be helpful to think about riparian areas and wetlands as two overlapping spheres that share many similarities and a few important differences. Both are highly productive ecosystems characterized by plant available water above or within the rooting zone. The two most important characteristics that differentiate riparian areas and wetlands are landscape position and duration of soil saturation. For riparian areas, the defining characteristic is a landscape position adjacent to and influenced by a surface water body. For wetlands, the defining characteristic is the duration of soil saturation, which allows wetland soil properties to develop. Not all riparian areas meet the formal definition of a wetland. Some riparian areas are not wet long enough to develop wetland soils. Those include confined streams with little soil development or mesic floodplain cottonwood galleries that are flooded only periodically. Conversely, while many wetlands form adjacent to water bodies, wetlands can also form in landscape positions isolated from surface water bodies, such as areas of regional groundwater discharge at the base of slopes or in isolated and ephemeral depressions. There are also many sites that are both wetland and riparian areas. Those include broader riparian shrublands, oxbows and sloughs on floodplains, and the margins of permanent lakes and ponds. The target population for riparian and wetland AIM includes both riparian areas and wetlands, including areas that meet just one definition and areas that meet both. Due to the overlap of riparian areas and wetlands and the natural hydrologic gradients that exist between and across these systems, sometimes the term riparian-wetland has been used to cover both concepts at once. For the purpose of this protocol, we use the phrase riparian and wetland areas to include all the applicable ecosystems within our target population. Now that you understand the definitions of riparian areas and wetlands, I will explain the paired concepts of Lotic and Lentic systems, which are terms used frequently in the BLM. Aquatic systems can be divided into Lotic and Lentic systems based on the energy of water movement. Lotic systems are associated with moving water in rivers and streams. They are high-energy systems with defined channels, though they can form broad floodplains. For Lotic systems, the emphasis is on the channel and its processes. The channel is an open conduit for carrying flowing water, dissolved and suspended material. Lotic systems, meaning rivers and streams, are monitored by the BLM's Lotic AIM program. In contrast, lentic systems are associated with still or slowly moving water. They are lower energy systems that occur in basins, on slopes, or on flats. They are most often associated with ponds and lakes, but they can occur on floodplains as oxbows and beaver ponds. Any channels within the actual lentic areas are slow-moving with diffuse edges. Vegetated lentic systems are monitored by the Riparian and Wetland AIM program. It's important to know that Lotic and Lentic systems can occur independently or together. The top photos show sites that have both Lotic, fast-moving water, and Lentic, slow-moving water, components. The bottom photos show Lotic sites without a Lentic component. Some sites on BLM land are monitored with both protocols because they collect very different information. With that background on riparian areas, wetlands, and Lotic and Lentic systems, let's look at the 6 criteria for applicable ecosystems, which is the default target population for the Riparian and Wetland AIM program. To be sampleable with this protocol, a site must have at least 10% cover of perennial vegetation, a dominance of hydrophytic vegetation, evidence of hydrology influenced by surface or groundwater, and be beyond the banks of an unvegetated river or stream channel. If surface water is present, it must be shallower than 50 centimeters. A site must have sufficient area to accommodate 3 25-meter transects and a minimum width of 2 meters. It is important to read the criteria in the manual carefully when evaluating sample sites. We will discuss each in more detail in the following slides. The first criteria for applicable ecosystems is perennial vegetation. Monitoring plots must have at least 10% cover of perennial vegetation under typical growing season conditions without disturbance, such as heavy use, wildfire, severe flooding, or prolonged drought. To make this determination, consider the natural or potential state of the riparian or wetland area. The core methods are vegetation-based and intended for vegetated system. A minimum cover of vegetation ensures that the methods can detect a signal from the data collected. When establishing a plot, perennial vegetation may be evenly distributed or it may be concentrated in patches. Bare ground can be included in the monitoring plot as long as the total cover of perennial vegetation is at least 10% of the monitoring plot. This criterion is meant to exclude bare playas and other temporary wetlands that naturally lack perennial vegetation, but it does not exclude systems that have high bare ground due to disturbance. Bare ground caused by disturbance can be an indicator of condition, and it is not a reason to exclude a site from sampling. If the cause of bare ground is unclear, consult with local resource specialists who know the area. The images on this slide show patches of bare ground that can be included in a monitoring plot. The photo in the upper right is a vegetated playa in northeastern California. If the entire site was characterized by the bare white soil in the foreground, the site would be rejected. Some playas are naturally bare, and we do not sample those sites that are naturally bare. But a mix of bare soil and vegetation is fine to include, as long as perennial vegetation makes up 10% cover. The photo on the bottom is a spring in Nevada that experiences heavy use and has more bare ground than it might in the absence of livestock or horse use. In that case, it is okay to include the bare ground. A change in management might allow more vegetation to grow in this site. Monitoring the site in its current condition and after a change in management might show an increase in vegetation cover and a decrease in bare ground. The second criterion is hydrophytic vegetation. Within existing canopy cover, the site must be dominated by hydrophytic vegetation. Hydrophytic species are those with a wetland indicator status of obligate, facultative wetland, or facultative based on the National Wetland Plant List. The table shown here, and included as Table 1 of the protocol, describes wetland indicator status ratings. An area is dominated by hydrophytic vegetation when more than 50% of the dominant species are hydrophytic or obligate, facultative wetland, or facultative. Dominant species are defined as those species that individually or collectively account for more than 50% of the total cover of vegetation, plus any species that, by itself, accounts for at least 20% of the total. The procedure for determining dominance is adapted from the Army Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual. Low cover of upland vegetation may occur within riparian or wetland areas that meet this criterion, as long as hydrophytic vegetation dominates overall. Similarly, low cover of hydrophytic vegetation may occur in upland areas that do not meet this criterion. However, discrete zones of upland vegetation, such as raised upland mounds or the distinct upland edge, should be limited to 10% of a monitoring plot, unless specified by monitoring objectives. The third criterion is hydrology. To meet the target population, a site must be influenced by surface or groundwater at some point in the growing season. Riparian and wetland areas are both, by definition, influenced by surface or groundwater. The exact boundaries of this influence can be difficult to detect consistently in the field, which is why this protocol relies primarily on vegetation to indicate longer-term patterns of inundation or saturation. However, indicators of hydrology developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can also be used to identify the likely boundary. Using the indicators in Appendix K, look for evidence that the site has experienced either inundation, which is flooding by surface water, or saturation, which is a high groundwater table. The evidence can be current, such as visual observation of standing water or saturated soils, or the evidence can be from the past, such as drift lines, soil cracks, or salt deposits. If evidence of surface or groundwater is not immediately apparent, a dominance of hydrophytic vegetation is sufficient to indicate that the site is influenced by water. The third criterion of hydrology also limits the portion of the monitoring plot that contains an unvegetated active river or stream channel. The field protocol for Lentic, riparian, and wetland systems can be used on floodplains and along the riparian zone, but it is not intended for Lotic river and stream systems. Along larger river systems, the boundary between the Lotic River channel and its floodplain is often clear, and both zones can be sizable. In these environments, the protocol should only be used on the floodplain, and monitoring plots should stop at the riverbank. In these cases, no more than 10% of the monitoring plot should include the unvegetated active channel, such as areas like the active sandbar in the upper right and the active cobble bar in the lower right. However, in some environments, such as springs and small stream systems, the channel may be very narrow and even diffuse without clear scour lines. In these environments, like the small stream on the left, the protocol can be applied across the whole system. Lotic stream monitoring may also be applicable in these environments, depending on the monitoring objectives. Pairing monitoring of the Lotic channel with monitoring the floodplain vegetation can provide the most complete assessment of stream and riparian resource condition. The fourth criterion limits the cover of perennial standing water deeper than 50 centimeters or 20 inches. If surface water is present, no more than 10% of the monitoring plot should include permanent standing water that is deeper than 50 centimeters during the growing season. This criterion is included for practical reasons. It is logistically difficult or impossible to sample vegetation along a transect in water deeper than 50 centimeters. This criterion does not exclude an entire riparian or wetland area if only a portion has deep water. It merely excludes that portion with deep water. This criterion only applies to permanent deep water. If deep water is temporary and may recede during the growing season, the riparian or wetland area could be sampled at a later time. The fifth and sixth criteria are included to ensure adequate sample area for the core methods. The site must have sufficient area to accommodate 3 25-meter transects, with individual transects spaced at least 5 meters apart. There is not one minimum area threshold, as there are various configurations that can accommodate 3 25-meter transects, including sites that are very narrow but more than 75 meters long. 3 25-meter transects ensures that data collected with this protocol are comparable between sample plots. Lastly, narrow sites must have a minimum average width of 2 meters. Small segments, less than 2 meters, can be included, but the majority of the monitoring plot should be at least 2 meters. A minimum of 2 meters in width allows for adequate sampling of the woody vegetation using the prescribed methods. There are several important tools that can help field crews determine whether a site meets the criteria. While there is no federally recognized guidance on how to delineate riparian areas in the field, many tools and resources have been developed to identify the boundaries of wetlands because they are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers and Environmental Protection Agency under the Federal Clean Water Act. Though the riparian and wetland aim target population is broader than wetlands alone, the tools can still help. For an area to be delineated as a wetland, 3 criteria must be positively identified: hydrophytic vegetation, wetland hydrology, meaning saturation or inundation for at least 15 consecutive days, and hydric soils. Of the 6 criteria for applicable ecosystems within the riparian and wetland aim population, 2 important criteria are similar to wetland delineation. Those are hydrophytic vegetation and hydrology, although for riparian and wetland aim, the hydrology criterion is broader and encompasses drier riparian sites as well as wetlands. Hydric soils, the 3rd criterion for wetland delineation, is not required for the riparian and wetland aim target population. However, observations of hydric soil provide important information about a site. To help practitioners delineate wetlands in different regions of the United States, the Army Corps of Engineers developed a series of regional supplements to the Wetland Delineation Manual. These documents include all regionally appropriate information needed to define a wetland. This slide shows 2 regional supplements commonly used in the West: the supplement for western mountains, valleys, and coasts, and the supplement for the arid West. Each supplement is specific to certain geographic regions across the country. These documents contain guidance on identifying hydrophytic vegetation, wetland hydrology, and hydric soils. They can be very helpful for AIM data collectors and should be carried with the crew in the field. As I mentioned, sites within the riparian and wetland AIM target population do not need to have hydric soils. However, soil characteristics provide additional clues about the site. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has defined several hydric soil indicators for each region in the United States. Regional supplements contain the hydric soil indicators specific to each region. This slide offers a preview on hydric soil indicators, which will be covered in a separate presentation. There are a wide variety of resources included within the applicable ecosystems that make up the target population for riparian and wetland AIM, such as those shown on this slide. I hope this presentation helps you better understand the major concepts behind the target population. This concludes this presentation defining the target population used by the Field Protocol for Lentic, Riparian, and Wetland Systems and the Riparian and Wetland AIM program. Thank you for listening.